And let me now turn to you, Magda. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm representing one of the youngest members of TEPSA, and it's my great honor to speak in this panel. The question that I was asked to reflect on was, can we keep the EU united and secure? Yes, we can.
Good.
Is a short answer, but it will be difficult. There are significant threats, and many of them were raised already, for keeping the EU historical commitments in place and to fight for its unity. The Russian aggression against Ukraine is a critical juncture that allows change, that also magnified the problems that we are facing. I'll focus on one thing only. In our research that we conduct on debate on future of Europe that started, as you all know, in 2015 or 2017, we compared 11 national cases as well as the European Parliament. And what we demonstrate in this research, among other things, is a distinctive pattern of rise of sovereignist actors. And a new narrative, not so new perhaps, but at least renewed, on future of Europe. And I'm focusing on sovereignists, not to bring another term that will replace the populist, Eurosceptics, right-wing actors, but as a concept that is focusing on their attempts to build a compelling narrative on the future of European integration that aims at repatriating, the term used by Sergio Fabrini, some of the EU competences back to the member states. So these political actors, they are very heterogeneous, we know it, but what they do for quite some time, and they will keep doing it in 2023, and specifically in the context of electoral years in many national contexts, as well as in the European Parliament in the following year. That what they build is a coherent, a more coherent vision of European integration, and that story, that narrative they built, is one of the threats that we will be facing, because the sovereignists are leading actors in several European governments. They are minor coalition partners in some other governments. And through the reinforcing pattern, what is the consequence of that new narrative building attempts is that they impact not only the other country context, but also the way they narrate future of European integration has a steady and creeping impact on other political actors. In many contexts, the narratives on the EU are reinforced by sometimes weakness, sometimes unattractiveness of pro-European arguments. Some scholars, De Wilde, Kaiser, McMahon, they use the jiu-jitsu metaphor, right? That you use your opponent's weakness to your advance. And I think this is also what they do in many attempts, is that they are using the pro-European narratives and actors' weaknesses to their own benefit, as those scholars that I've mentioned demonstrated. The trend of reinforcing the ultra-skeptical position towards European integration and sometimes far-right political agenda that is part of it may ultimately impact the core of EU external policies, including the EU enlargement, neighborhood and foreign and defense. Even though they are far from consistent or similar concerning some areas, what we see, for instance, already is the shift attention from the EU enlargement, not only towards the newer candidate countries, such as in Hungary for Ukraine, but also, as some of you know, or most of you know, in Bulgaria for North Macedonia, for instance. Sovereignists disagree on many aspects, such as relations with NATO, transatlantic relations. What they have in common, though, in that area, is specifically distrust towards any federalizing conceptions, and specifically distrust to European big players, France and Germany, in many instances. So they may hinder attempts to reform EU foreign policy, as well as actively prevent developments of strategic autonomy. Why? Because sovereignists are increasingly utilizing various strategies in order to further polarize our debate on EU foreign security policy, on external relations, in the end of the day also in the context of the war in Europe. Security for them is closely, intimately linked with identity sovereignty. And through these identitarian frames, they polarize debate on EU foreign security policy, and they will continue doing so. In the end of the day, they also foster the process of contestation in many national contexts, importing this to the European level as well. And one of the fears here is that what many, again, scholars noted, that there is this shift for pragmatic justifications for EU's engagements at the expense of normative narratives and motivations, particularly in the context of EU enlargement. And this is not only perceived as a threat domestically, but it also is picked up by the partner countries, both in South and Eastern neighborhood, that this shift from normative to pragmatic is problematic for them, because they want Europe to speak with the normative language. They want Europe, and specifically in some context, civil society actors, they want to have a clear commitment that we will support democratic development and that we will protect them as the European Union and member states. And the sovereignists in many instances are actually acting against that. They are, even with this soft sort of contestation, they push for the pragmatic narratives. And this in itself is, at least to me, a threat. I'll stop here. I think I'll utilize my 5 minutes. I'll have some other points maybe to raise later, but this is my initial thoughts and reaction. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magda. I was relieved in the beginning when you said we can become more secure and united, but I was a little bit worried here when you started to talk about all the threats against integration. So I'm looking forward to the continued discussion on this. I'm sure others will pick up on this. Roderick, let me now turn to you for your introductory reflections.
Do that, Jakob. Thank you. Righto. I'll be surprised if you can hear me. Firstly, I have a cold, and as a result, I'm drinking quite a lot of coffee. but now I've dipped my microphone successively into my coffee, so it's going to be an interesting 5 minutes.
So raise hands in the back if you hear Roderick.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hi, guys.
It's okay. It's okay.
Happy days. All right. Three quick points. Three hopefully quick points from my side. Firstly, we're obviously in a very difficult situation where we need somehow long-term clarity about some really complicated issues. But I think we are getting there, just rather messily. So for me, two of the really big sort of dilemmas, I think, and you've addressed them in part. Firstly, how can Europe stand on its own 2 feet when providing security sufficiently to keep American support in Europe, but don't allow that relationship to the US to turn into a risk in itself? And secondly, the question a little bit, how do we turn the EU, which started off as a process, and we've kind of tried to turn it into an international actor over the last 10 years or so, into an order, and an order that stretches out into Eastern Europe? I think we are messily getting answers to these questions, but it really is quite messy. I asked myself, who would have thought that a Sweden that's about to hold an EU presidency would be spending most of its time talking about NATO? But I think in hindsight it's rather useful. It has flushed out the French on what they think of European security. It's flushed out the British, and it's certainly flushing out the Hungarians and the Turks. Who would have thought that a France that proposed the European political community as a sort of alternative to EU enlargement, then agreed to candidate status for Ukraine and Moldova, and may accidentally have invented the method and the format for making EU enlargement policy a little bit more geopolitical, and stretching it out into Eastern Europe, poor old French people. And who would have thought that the Germans, who responded to their energy problems in a sort of Germany first kind of a way, not only with its 200 billion domestic measure, but also frankly the rather shameless approach that they took initially to southern member states, saying it's going to be a warm winter for you people. You wouldn't like the Eurozone's largest economy to catch a cold, would you? That sort of behaviour has somehow transformed into a proper debate, I think, about a European energy policy. So really difficult situation, but I think we are messily making progress. Second point for me, I think it's very easy to bash our governments for sticking to old ways of thinking about these things, but I would say I think that's quite unfair, not hugely unfair. You can bash Sweden for letting Finland do the sort of heavy work when thinking about joining NATO. You can bash the French for sort of being enticed back to Gaullist thinking, and when they talk about European autonomy, a sort of anti-US, anti-UK position, and you can bash the Germans for, I think, struggling to see the stakes and to really focus on protecting the population from the real threats. Putting a lot of money into cushioning the effects of the war in Ukraine, not putting quite as much money into actually arming the Ukrainians. But I would, I think, take an optimistic note there and point out that I think we probably have two of the most reformist governments in Paris and in Berlin that I at least can remember. And I suspect that the sort of assumption that they're stuck in the past makes that rather self-fulfilling. So if I chat to my French colleagues, they say Macron is precisely trying to get away from a lot of the roots of French foreign policy. That European autonomy is Gaullist in form, but not in flavour. So yes, he wants to reform French foreign policy around himself, as de Gaulle did, but in flavour he wants to do something very different. And it is a mix of US and UK bad behaviour and the Germans saying, you're awfully Gaullist, aren't you, that sort of drags him back to the norm. So that is my second point. I think it's easy to bash governments, but I think we underestimate just where the reformist potential is in the EU, and coming into the next sort of institutional cycle from 2024, next year I think is going to be key. So the Swedish presidency is really going to be key to really sort of unleash that reformist potential. Third point, and then I'll shut up, Jakob, or do you want me to shut up now?
No, go on.
We're all good?
Go on.
All right. I think my only danger that I would really point out is that we may be at risk of sort of breaking the wrong taboos. So if I chat to people in government in Berlin, they're very keen to learn from the mistakes of the past. They are disassociating themselves from the previous government, and they say that the one thing that they really think is correct is making the EU geopolitical. That's that's what the last government did properly, and it's something that you mentioned as well, Diana. I have a horrible feeling though that the German version of making the EU geopolitical over the last 5 years has been Germany as a status quo power, very nervous about disruptions and reformist efforts, cracking down heavily on them. And sometimes it has confused disruption for crisis and reformers for revanchists and whatever else it may be. Now we have a genuine threat to the European status quo, and Germany, I think, has kind of lost sight of who its enemies are, and I think possibly needs to reach out and open the tent a little bit in a way that it hasn't in the past. So by all means, make the EU geopolitical, but I think the last 5 years of trying to make the EU geopolitical, we've perhaps been tilting at the wrong enemies. So that for me is is the slight word of warning. I think we're at risk of kind of breaking the wrong taboos. The Germans very keen on sort of embracing power politics, but I think they may have alienated a good number of potential partners in and around Europe. The end.
Very good.
Thank you.
So maybe that's where we should start. How to make the EU a truly geopolitical actor. And maybe if I could ask Magda and Roderick if you would like to comment on some of the lists of priorities that Diana mentioned here. I didn't hear reform, the reform cycle very prominently. Maybe you did say it, so maybe that's a question for you to think about. But let's maybe start with Magda.
Thank you very much. I noted 3 points, and I was very glad to sort of beforehand, and I was very happy to hear a kind of a confirmation in the previous panel on this one. So my response to this will be how to make the EU as a geopolitical actor. The short answer again is to assure a unified political will to deliver on the commitments, and that will mean, for me at least, and I'm coming from Central and Eastern Europe, that will mean, as what State Secretary Jansen said, provide significant and predictable aid for Ukraine. And be prepared for what will soon become a key theme of that, which is different member states having issues on this. And they already are expressing some of the reservations, how this is organized, from where the money comes, and from where the money will go. Even the cursory analysis of the European Commission documents on the 18 billion aid package for Ukraine show, for instance, strengthening kind of focus on anti-corruption measures. This is gonna also mean a lot of discussions and an ongoing dialogue with the Ukrainian actors. Keep the enlargement methodology in place and counter enlargement fatigue early on, because it will come. It will come both in the EU and it will come in the countries that are exposed to it, to the process of EU enlargement. And again, the bottom line, I think here is that the EU has tools or sets of instruments that can be applied, but there must be will to do it, and there must be a dialogue. And that brings me to the third point about the geopolitical, which is beware of diluting political commitments that you made. And that is a comment to European political community. I know that, Roderick, you published a paper on this in which you drafted some of the elements, and I'll only say on this that as much as the forum in itself demonstrated certain usefulness, and it may so for quite some time, what we need to be aware is that EPC, or European Political Community, cannot become a never-ending waiting room, vestibule to the European club, or keeping the actors, or at least for quite some time, at the EU doorstep. This is not a good place to be. And everybody who's been there knows that. So make commitment that this initiative may last as long as it serves certain purpose, better let it make temporary in its functioning. Because as many in this room studied differentiated integration, that's my last point. The blueprint behind the EPC might be to create a broadened confederal Europe, as Stab suggested in some point. But in a way, that vision has, again, and I'm relying on the research that we've done on the political actors' perception of both internal and external differentiated integration, that this is opposed by many actors in Europe, particularly here in Northern Europe, and particularly in the place I'm coming from, which is Central and Eastern Europe, because it is the instrument of that is perceived as a dominance, as an unjustified exercise of power by EU institutions, by other member states, and as such is destructive. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Magda. Maybe we should let Diana comment on this right away. Are we giving too much support and too little military assistance, for instance?
Well, first I want to say about the reform agenda that I will pass on that, because I do think it's clear that Ukraine it is a top priority, and we need to keep delivering support, be it humanitarian, be it economic, be it political, be it militarily, and that is a top priority. We need to support Ukraine. We need to make sure that Ukraine wins this war. There is no, as I see it, no alternative to that, and that in itself is quite a daunting task. Also, keeping in mind that we need to keep EU unity, we need to keep close to other partners, and in particular the Euro-Atlantic relationship in this. And then I think also, I think experience from any other presidency before shows that then reality kicks in. I mean, you can well have a situation where something else happens. As I learned in Afghanistan, expect the unexpected. So we can have something else that completely overrides it. I think it's reasonable to believe that Ukraine will not go away regardless, but it might be something related to Ukraine, yet another migration crisis. We see now what's happening on the ground in Ukraine. It's really terrible with this targeting on civilian infrastructure that makes it very difficult for the Ukrainians to stay, to keep going. I'm sure they will, but you can never rule out we will have another migration, a wave of migration, for instance. Or we could also have developments in Russia that all of a sudden goes another way than the sort of kind of status quo we have today. So yeah, but I agree. We really need to do whatever it takes to make sure Ukraine wins this war, and that is a priority. Thank you.
So this means that for the time being, whatever reform agendas is secondary to that.
Yeah, we have 6 months. I'm not saying we can't work on multiple fronts, and I would also say that we are reforming ourselves as we go along. For instance, I think how we now work with our civilian tools and how we it's flexible, it's new. I mean, we have this EU MUM mission like kicking off in no time, and it's also sort of a practical reform process on how we refine the tools we have. Reform can be so many things.
Absolutely.
And I think if we look where we are now within the union as where we were 12 months ago, I think we have quite another. There are different interests. There have always been and will always be, but there is also a new sense of unity. So yeah, I'm.
And on my second question there, making sure that Ukraine wins the war, the balance between support, financial, whatever, humanitarian, to the military.
You need all of these pillars. You need we need the humanitarian support. We need the help in energy, for instance, now to make it through the winter. We need long-term a long-term plan to rebuild Ukraine. We need micro financial support for Ukraine, making sure that the Ukrainian economy doesn't collapse. And obviously, you can't win a war without military, without weapons or ammunition. So we need to help out with all this. And I'm pleased to say that the Swedish government, since taking office, has been quite offensive in this. We launched a winter package, as it was called, 2 weeks ago, with both weapons of 3 billion krona and a humanitarian package, partly for Ukraine and also to Moldova, which a country we shouldn't forget about in this context that has been deeply affected by the war. To the amount of 620 million krona, and then again after that another 100 million to support this grain from Ukraine. So I think also we walk the talk in terms of leaning forward, because we want to see more support from our European partners.
Thank you, Diana. And I guess the challenge as EU presidency will be to make sure that that view is upheld by everybody else, or
No, I think you
encouraging
both
that.
pointed out the challenges in keeping unity and keeping the eyes on the ball in this regard. But it's of paramount importance.
Roderick.
I can't read my own writing. Seriously,
No, I can't read it either.
no.
Can't help
No,
it.
no.
Mine.
Magdalena managed to spontaneously type hers. I can't make head or tail, but I think I've got 3 headlines. The first one is I've written false threats, crime! Exclamation mark. You said, Diana, that we weren't really surprised by Russia, and we'd already been making sort of mental preparations for our security posture. That to me is kind of what I was trying to get at when I was saying that I feel like Germany has been tilting at the wrong enemies for the last 5 years or so. You chat to German diplomats, and they complain bitterly about the Americans and say, they're confecting a bipolar sort of conflict with the Chinese. So we line up and protect US privilege. But you press them a bit harder and they say, God, I wish we had a China. Something to sort of focus minds. Now they've got a bloody China. It's Russia. It's an existential threat to European order. But we have spent, I think, so long sort of tilting at slightly the wrong rivals and enemies, and it's in the German mindset over the last 5 years, it was a strange mix of irregular migrants, criminals, populist and corrupt EU partners, and this sort of arc of instability around the EU that just popped up from nowhere and nothing to do with us. And I think it's difficult for Germany now to make the distinction and say, no, this is a different kind of threat, and perhaps we've alienated these people. So for me, there's a false threat element, and the focus on crime, which Hans also dealt with in his speech, kind of encapsulates that for me. Also, the focus on making Europol into the new Frontex, by the sounds of things. Frontex 5 years ago, we turned, Germany turned into the organization for protecting the rule of law and the European way of life in Europe. Look where we are now. So I'm rather worried about Sweden now saying we need to do that with Europol. We do have a real threat from crime, but it is around illicit trade and illicit finance and Russian corruption and sanctions busting and so on. So I would always put those threats into that really sort of existential crisis that we're facing. So that for me is the first point. Are we constructing, or are we sort of still looking at false threats? The second one is false solutions, and I've written protectionism because I'm British. There's been talk from both of you around sort of made in Europe, reshoring, recycling in Europe and so on. I wonder that these are kind of false solutions, and we've become a little bit afraid of our own shadow. So anything that's openness and trade is other countries exploiting our critical dependencies. That worries me a little bit. I think, if we fall into these kind of false solutions, yes, we've decoupled our energy from Russia. Yes, that can be great for energy transition. But that doesn't make us somehow independent. And are we just going to walk into the next sort of trap by becoming dependent on Chinese rare earths? There are sometimes serious, compromises around critical dependencies, but I think this mix of kind of protectionism and false friends of nearshoring, reshoring, and so on actually adds to the threat and throws us into them. Third one I've written, I think, EU presidency, neutrality, leadership. And what I think I mean by that is what both of you said about Swedish principles and being clear on where Sweden stands also in dealing with other EU member states. And I think that for me, Jim said the presidency needs to be neutral. I think we're kind of beyond that, and I think the presidency needs to stand for something. I would expect the Swedish presidency to stand up for values. I think it's important that we don't put the expedience of EU unity ahead of things like the rule of law. I think we need to show to, for example, We had an Egyptian delegation who came through the other day and said, why would we ever undertake the difficult reforms that the Ukrainians have undergone if you don't stand up for them? So other bits of the world are watching whether we stand up for our values. For me, that behoves Sweden because it is known for its principles, and I think it will be attacked for it. And the Turks and the Hungarians are doing precisely that. Last little thought, we in Berlin talk a lot these days about feminist foreign policy in a way that you've stopped doing here. That I think makes my colleagues a little bit sad. But I think there is a wealth of knowledge here around those principles and trying to sort of meld principles with realpolitik. The government so far has talked a lot about feminist foreign policy in Berlin, but every time we have had women leading protests in Belarus or Dagestan or Iran or Afghanistan, the government has gone, well, that's interesting, and not been able to join it together. So, final thought, I think Swedish principles around that, because we are missing a lot of opportunities. It's not just a threat-based sort of international environment, and I think we can really sort of use Sweden's principles to make the most of those. Help the poor old Germans to do that. We'd be awfully grateful. Thank you.
That's a great list, Roderick. So which values will we stand for as the EU presidency, Diana, do you think?
I think you can rest assured we will stand for the values we always stood for and continue to do that. And though we sort of stopped using feminist foreign policy as a sort of headline, we will continue. And we did also before starting using feminist foreign policy as some sort of brand. We will continue to fight for and gender equality. So I think you can rest assured. Don't worry about Swedish values. We're well grounded in them, and we will continue to pursue them as a sort of baseline for whatever we do. I also want to comment on what you said on trade and security, and I find this. I mean, this is a difficult discussion, difficult topic in many ways. But I think it would be sad if we would not learn from what we should have learned by now, when we ended up being so terribly energy dependent of Russia. Though we had a sort of a vision and an agreement that we would steer away from we would diversify our energy supply. Instead, we did the opposite. I think also this whole I think there is a thorough understanding now that there is something more when we talk about free trade and openness. There is another layer that also needs to play a role, and that is security in one way or the other, and how to balance this in a way that we won't end up protectionist, and we won't end up isolated, and we won't end up with a poorer world, because trade makes it contributes to wealth. It's a fine balance, and I would not be the right person to answer how to balance it. But I think it's certainly something. It would be sad to see that we couldn't learn from what we just painfully going through with this. What do you call it?
Decoupling.
Decoupling. Thank you.
Well, I guess the new reality is that we have both. We have geopolitical confrontations and dependencies at the same time,
Yeah.
and they're shifting the whole time, which is seen in different types of supply chains where competition on edge technologies are all of a sudden something you need to collaborate on, and otherwise areas where you compete wildly. We've talked about unity, European unity. And I think that what everybody thought about or feared throughout this fall was the impact of the energy crisis for cohesion in Europe. It seems as if that might be taken care of, but I'm not so sure. And this is like a bigger question, which also is linked to the question of decoupling and reshoring and protectionism, etc. And that is, for how long do you think that European unity will remain on the sanctions, given the competing commercial interests, etc., and what can we do to uphold them? Maybe we'll start with Roderick and Magda, and then I'll let you comment.
Let me rest. Just joking.
Go on, Magda.
No, now it's your turn.
Oh, it's me, is it? Okay. I don't know how long it'll, how long unity will stay. I think there are some practical things we can do. I mean, obviously the bigger picture answer is we need a greater sense of what we want to achieve in Ukraine and to get towards it so that people understand what the pain is for. The practical answers, I think, are improve the implementation regime. I don't understand the sanctions implementation regime in the EU, and I have had it explained to me at length by people who are supposed to. It is incredibly complex. Each member state names a few responsible agencies. They normally nominate 2 or 3 of them. In practice, they have 10 or 15 agencies and institutions that are implementing them, etc., etc. Not only practically does that make it easy to get round sanctions, if that leaks out into the public domain, I think that'll have a serious shock for European unity. So I think that's the first point for me. The second one is that we need to get out of the habit of transactionalism. If we want the Turks or the Hungarians or whoever it is to abide by the rules of the club, then I think we need to be very clear about that. And quite often we're paying these states to be doing something that is actually in their national interest anyway. So I think we need to get out of the habit of that, because otherwise I think sanctions and sanction unity is just going to be caught up in these funny sort of package deals that you're having at the moment with Hungary and the RRF and so on. And I think that the third thing for me is we need to expand the alliance of states that are introducing sanctions. I thought, Dan, your starting point was quite right, saying what is happening in Ukraine is of global significance because it breaks all of these international norms. But I think that we need to get better at saying to states outside of the EU and outside of the G7, OECD, this impacts you. So I think we need to broaden the sort of base of countries that are implementing sanctions. These would be my 3 sort of practical measures, I think.
Very interesting. Anyone would like to add to this, Magda?
I think the data that we have from sort of assessing the popular response are fairly optimistic in a way. The citizens are committed to EU support, European citizens for Ukraine. And of course, there is a lot of threats that this will wane off with time and with costs, but I think the biggest threat really are the government. And I will second what Roderick said already, is that one of the key points to me, and I was very happy to, I'm coming from Poland, and I was very happy to hear what Chairman Womack said as one of the key things that the Swedish presidency will not be open to much of compromise is a rule of law crisis. And I think this gives me a hint, or this gives me a sort of hint to think that one of the key points here will be to put your red flags. Where? Because we know that those actors, the governmental actors or the sovereignist actors that I called them earlier, that they will search for places to bargain, to open the bargain. And it's important to put where you can start certain negotiations on some things and where are your red flags. But of course, the key point will be to keep to those red flags and not allow them to be moved. And I think that is the key element in the forthcoming. If you want to keep the unity, you need to have a strategy where you can negotiate and where you cannot at all. This comes back to certain values, because if we are not committed to these values internally, what is our credibility to external actors. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Magda. I will soon open up for questions in the audience, so please prepare yourself if you would like to put a question. And I'll ask you to reply or comment if you would like to Diana, and especially this last point that Roderick made about expanding the alliance of countries abiding to the sanctions. It's linked to the bigger point of this battle for narratives in the world. And since you are now working not only with Ukraine, I know you went recently to Somalia and Kenya. So I mean, how do you see that playing out, and what could the EU do to really address that much bigger battle of narratives? Yes. So, Diana.
Yeah. Well, here I think EU is well placed to do a lot to influence the narrative, to counter the Russian narrative in the global South. There are a lot of initiatives in this respect in public diplomacy, and also sort of underlining in our AU, the African Union partnership, what we actually bring to the table and how important this partnership between African Union countries and EU is in ordinary people's lives in the global South. But that is, of course, important, and more can and should be done. If I can comment on your sort of questions on how long the sanctions will stay, I would say, well, first, it's not only about having them there on paper, it's also about being better on implementing them in each and every respect. And hopefully, and adding new sanctions, implementing existing ones. I think they will have to stay as long as it takes. It's complex and it's difficult, and there are a lot of objectives here and there, but it simply, as I see it, there is not much of an alternative, or I would say the alternative is so much worse and so much more dangerous and so much more expensive in the end. So even if it's problematic, and they will have to stay until as long as it takes.
Thank you, Diana. I think it's time to open up for questions from the audience. We have an extremely impressive audience here, so I'm sure I see one request for the floor there. Do we see others? Yeah, but we'll start with Andreas Umland there in the third row.
Yeah, maybe just continuing on the sanctions issues mentioned by Roderick and Diana. What kind of chance and need and usefulness would you see perhaps in the future of secondary sanctions? Because if one imagines that the war continues and that we may actually even get new waves of escalation, you know, maybe we will get into a much larger debate and in a trade war, really, perhaps even global trade war, where you know, we will actually have to go, or we will want to go even further than now, sanctioning not just Russian firms, but also firms that cooperate with Russia around the world.
Thank you. Was that directed to one person or the whole panel?
Whoever feels.
Anyone would like to pick up on that one?
Are we allowed to collect?
We'll collect questions. Yeah, why not? I saw a second request for the floor over there to the right. Please, since I don't know you, please just introduce yourself briefly.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. I'm Andrei Rodulescu from Romania, and my question regards the new economic governance adopted following the Great Recession, because we couldn't manage to complete the new economic governance implemented following the Great Recession, namely the completing the banking union, the capital markets union. I mean, the projects that have been on the pipeline over the past 10 years almost. and that are very important also, especially taking into account the normalization of the monetary policy nowadays with impact for the financing costs of the European companies in a context of also the high pressure from the energy prices. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have a third? I think we had a third request for the floor here as well, and then we'll take the three for your replies. Jim.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very short question, but it's a slightly brutal one. I completely, with my heart, agree with you. Values, no transaction. The simple fact of life is, in normal life, that's not happening. Can I ask you a question? If Orban...
I hate this question already.
Yes. If Orban, it's quite possible, will block the 18 billion for Ukraine, will we say, no negotiation, no discussion, we forget about the 18 billion?
Right. We have three questions on secondary sanctions, new economic governance, and energy challenges, and transactions or values. Magdalena, did you want to start?
Well, I can, since Roderick doesn't like the question, so I'll help a little bit.
Yeah, happy days.
Okay.
Transaction, yes.
No, I'm kidding. I think every government in the EU is pragmatic. Those that are closer to elections may be a little bit less responsive. But Viktor Orban won his elections not that long ago. That makes me optimistic in some sense that his pragmatic side will, at least in some places, prevail. And again, that will mean on the EU side that we need to know exactly where is the line of that negotiations ending, right? And this is, I think, something that requires thinking of many different stakeholders. What do we really can say in that regard? What is the red flag in the end of the day? So that would be my answer to these questions. I'll leave the others to, and maybe Roderick also would
Pragmatism.
like to do.
So, Roderick, what do you have to say about this?
Happy.
Well, there's an axis forming. So I'll start at the beginning. Secondary sanctions. I think that probably is the direction of travel as far as I can see. I would put a complementary emphasis on two things, I think. One is, and that's particularly the case in Germany, just finding a new relationship between government and business. The Germans have kind of picked up the French language around sort of industrial policy and whatever else, but it simply doesn't suit the relationship between German government and German business. The family-owned firms in Germany are behaving on the whole responsibly. Larger firms on the whole are not. A debate is starting just now around sort of corporate geopolitical responsibility and how do you make German firms behave more responsibility in the current sort of geo-economic situation. So I think, you know, as part of a kind of secondary sanctions thing, just finding a different way to make German business behave responsibly would be useful. I think the second thing is that I think when it comes to secondary sanctions, even more than on sanctions, we need to find more international allies, and I think that we need to make sure that we're not weakening multilateral institutions by opting for those kinds of solutions and by accident strengthening a different set of global economic institutions that our friends the Chinese might be building up, or whatever it might be. So I think, you know, by all means secondary sanctions, but I think that there are complementary things that need to be done. It's not my area of expertise, so you're allowed to call bullshit on that if you like. Secondly, on the failure to fix the roof while the sun was sort of shining on sort of Eurozone reform and so on. I mean, yeah. So it's still a mess, and I think, you know, we face another crisis. The only thing I would say is I think, and I've said this at a TEPSA thing before, the Germans in particular had a habit of going into every crisis and saying, this is an opportunity. And it was an opportunity to dust off an old project and push it through, which meant that we hit every crisis, we then dusted off a 20-year reform program to complete this or that union, which means that we have a lot of very siloed, half-finished projects. I think if they are half-finished, maybe now is the time to think about how do we link these things up? How do we link up, an unfinished financial framework, an unfinished migration framework, an unfinished tech framework, an unfinished energy framework under the new geoeconomic environment, and say, how do you put these things together to ensure access to investment capital, the best minds, cheap and efficient energy, critical technology? What can we do to build these projects together rather than doing the German thing of this is an opportunity to do something old? And the last thing, Jim, curse you. So I haven't, like a fool, I mention Hungary and then I don't follow what's been happening properly. But as I understand it, the Commission actually has an opportunity now to squash the Hungarians on this. Sorry for Hungarians in the audience. But one, because of the link to sort of long-term funding on cohesion policy rather than on the RRF. So yes, we let the RRF through, but we keep this kind of long-term thing. So the Hungarians have said, haha, RRF, you want to spend this money because if you hold it back, you, the EU, lose it as well. So you're going to give in. So I think that the bringing in of the long-term, don't wave your hand at me like that. Well, we're good, are we? Okay. And the other thing I think is that there's potential to sequence the time when the decisions are taken on Ukraine and then delay the decision on withholding Hungarian funds. So there is, I think, an opportunity on this, if I understand correctly, and I'm just parroting what my cleverer colleagues say. That doesn't resolve the broader issue. I don't think that we are still in transactionalism, and this is a one-off chance to fix that. But the deeper issue remains. So I think I can answer your Hungarian question, but I can't answer the broader issue that you're getting at. I think it's too late for that, unfortunately.
Thank you, Roderick. Did you want to make a
Yeah,
comment
okay,
as
just
well?
one comment on the third sort of transactionary approach versus values. I would like to introduce a third element, diplomacy. So our job as a presidency will be to facilitate EU unity so we can continue forward together.
That's great, Diana. We're actually drawing to a close. But if I challenge you, all the three of you here, what would you like to say as a one sentence most important priority for the Swedish presidency, or maybe opportunity, trying to get a positive twist? Can I challenge you like this? Do you have something on the top of your head?
Ukraine.
Ukraine, that was not even a sentence. A word. Can you beat that, Roderick and Magda?
I'm not going to try. I can't even blow my nose. I'm so sorry for whoever has this microphone after me. No, Ukraine. We're all good.
Magda?
I think I'll second it. Ukraine, and
It's also the title of this panel.
It's true. It's war in Europe. How do we confront the new realities? Well, thank you so very much. I think we should give the speakers a big applause.